13 Sentinels Aegis Rim is one of the only major games that slipped through my fingers back in 2020. It was released in Japan in 2019, but it got its worldwide release in September of 2020. In the couple of months following the game's release, I heard plenty of nice things about it and even saw its gorgeous art style for myself, which was more than enough to put the game on my radar. The general idea of the game goes something like this. Kaiju monsters from the future are terrorizing 1985 Japan. The only thing that stands between the Daimos, as they are called, and humanity being wiped out is a handful of high schoolers armed with giant mechs. It may sound a bit silly, but the game makes no apologies for it, and I respect that. Let's take a look to see if this wacky setup pays off. The game starts off with a slow-burning prologue that serves to introduce the first batch of characters and acquaint the player with the combat system. After the prologue, you get 3 separate choices from the main menu and you can start tackling things at your own pace. Destruction, which is where all of the combat is, Remembrance, which is a typical visual novel adventure sort of setup, and how you uncover most of the story. And the third option is Analysis, which serves as a cutscene theater, a timeline, and a glossary for the player to refer back to anytime they might start to lose the plot. I'll start with Destruction. The combat system presents itself as a pseudo-RTS game sort of system. The enemies move around in real time, but as soon as you pull up a menu to command one of your Sentinels, time stops. The object of most of the missions boils down to either eliminating all of the kaiju, or defending your terminal long enough for its defenses to come online. I have to say, I played the game on normal, and I did not find myself needing to be all that strategic while I played. My method for almost everything was to send my melee attackers at the big armored guys, and use my ranged guys with a variety of multi-targeting attacks to deal with the smaller stuff, and I never really had to think very far beyond that. There was this one exception where the mission I was doing was inexplicably wrecking me, and I ended up losing, but when I tried again, I did almost the same thing, and I won that time, and I was never super clear on what I was doing differently. It seems like there were still other systems at play, even though I never found them necessary. There was a whole plethora of upgrades to give the various Sentinels, but, I never found myself needing anything besides maxing out the armor-piercing melee attack, and then maxing out the multi-targeting missiles for the ranged guys. I'm willing to bet that the hard mode probably makes fuller use of all of these other elements, but as my own experience stands, the combat was just kind of there, relatively inoffensive, but not what I was there for. As I mentioned before, the Remembrance section plays out like a branching path visual novel. This is where the lion's share of the story is experienced, but I'm just gonna focus on how it's structured for right now. Each of the 13 protagonists get their own story for the player to experience, and each of these stories are segmented into a set of vignettes that don't last any more than 20 minutes per section most of the time. As far as what you're actually doing in these segments, it's the normal 2D adventure game kind of gameplay. Mostly you walk around and talk to people. There's the occasional presenting or asking characters about one of your keywords, which is normally a person of interest or an object that you find. And of course, with the whole branching path thing, your actions determine which branch of the story you get to see. Thankfully, rather than the typical make a decision between A or B that changes a detail found in choice-based games, say like something made from Telltale or Quantic Dream, this game intends for you to see everything. Once you select a character, you're shown a timeline of how their story branches, and from there on, the typical adventure game triggers like talk to this person in the hallway or find a soda can on the rooftop or some other silliness will determine what branch you follow for that vignette, but each one ends with a detail or revelation that is crucial to the overarching plot. Once you select that character, again, you'll be taken back to before the timeline branches so you can explore a different option and see a new key detail. This part of the game comes with a fast forward button so that you don't have to listen to the same conversations over and over again. A sprint button also helps alleviate the potential tedium of traversing through the same places several times. And another handy feature is that when you examine the branches on the character's timeline, oftentimes if you look at one that you haven't done yet, it can be highlighted and it will tell you the relevant keywords for pursuing that particular path. The game is also good at choosing when to make you stop. Each character will have part of their story locked off at certain points. The lock will lift when you reach a relevant part of another character's story, typically some sort of intersecting point. I feel like this is an effective way to curate the pace of the story, since some of the mystery would be diminished if you ran through a character's path all in one go. It'd be a known quantity every time they showed up elsewhere, and that would be a little boring. The story of 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim is the reason to play it. The game takes an in medias res approach where the massive kaiju battle that the destruction portion of the game centers around is, for all intents and purposes, the climax of the story, but it's also where the game starts you off. The Remembrance portion is all about the 13 protagonists' journeys to the final battle. The comparison I keep falling back on is like how Octopath Traveler had its bevy of different stories playing out simultaneously, but this game has those stories actually intersect in a meaningful way. The non-linear storytelling is quite effective in this game as well. Oftentimes I found myself just as fascinated by where the events were placed as I did the action that was unfolding before me. It was like trying to unravel a massive puzzle, and I really appreciated it for that. Despite being non-linear and quite wacky at times, I never found myself feeling like I was totally lost in this game. The event theater in the analysis section is nice enough to put everything in chronological order, so if I ever had any questions about how an event related to something else, it was easy enough to go and check. The glossary also helped provide clarity for all of the terms that the game uses that might take some getting used to, and it provided clarity on what time period the characters came from and where their motivations seemed to be up to that point in the story. As far as the characters are concerned, I would describe them as good enough. There's not a protagonist whose story I disliked playing through. The moment-to-moment banter and the way that the characters interact with each other was really entertaining. I ended up really liking Ogata and Kisaragi because of that. That being said, I don't think any of them really had an arc that I would write home about. It's easy to see why. All of the individual character stories were made more to service the progression of the mystery rather than the progression of the characters. But I feel like with a little bit of tweaking, they could have had a few really good character arcs that would have sat with me for well after I finished the game. Before I move on from the story, I'll offer one small bit of critique. The prologue is a slow burn, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but because it's so focused on introducing characters and bouncing you around from protagonist to protagonist, in addition to the kaiju battle tutorials, it became a little hard to get a handle on what was going on at first. It's a small complaint because it's only about an hour and a half in like a 30 to 40 hour game, and it isn't that bad. I just found myself feeling like it was taking a little while to get anywhere at the start. Aegis Rim is another game with a gorgeous hand-drawn art style. I found myself admiring the backdrops in this game pretty frequently. One of the game's favorite shots is some variation of park or bridge at sunset, and it's easy to see why. It is absolutely stunning. The other environments are excellent too, such as a city at nighttime or even the walkway of the school. They all have a pretty relaxing atmosphere to them. The character designs manage to all be pretty distinct too, even though most of them are just wearing school uniforms. Everyone gets their own thing to inject a bit of personality into their look. Another visual highlight was how they nailed the scale of the kaiju and sentinels when you get to see them in the story sections. There was one scene that stood out to me in particular where it had one of the characters viewing a fight between the two from the window of a skyscraper. It was really solid. 13 Sentinels, Aegis Rim gets a sound recommendation from me. Vanillaware managed to weave together an immaculate tapestry of a story out of the 13 paths that they presented. Several of the game's elements, such as the excellent moment-to-moment writing and lovely art design, all work to service the intricately crafted plot, and I found myself captivated by the intrigue that the game presented. If you aren't a fan of games with a heavy emphasis on story, this probably won't be for you. However, if you're a fan of visual novels or RPGs with a large focus on plot, then this would certainly be a game worth checking out.